Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help you thrive as a cyber risk manager. On today's episode, your virtual Chief Information Security Officer is Kip Boyle, and your virtual Cybersecurity Counsel is Jake Bernstein. Visit them at cyberriskopportunities.com and focallaw.com.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today?
Hey, Jake. Hi. We have a guest today. We're going to talk with Michael Garcia because he co-authored a report that I think our audience needs to know about. I wouldn't say it's the easiest report to read, but after I looked at it, I was like, I got to get Michael on here to decode this for us. We're not the intended audience, but we'll get into that. His report is called A Roadmap to Strengthen U.S. Cyber Enforcement. Where do we go from here?
That sounds really interesting. And, I have some experience in this area. So, Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, we're happy that you're here. Thanks for making the time. Would you introduce yourself and let our listeners know just a little bit about your background? How did you get here?
Absolutely. So my name is Michael Garcia. I'm a senior policy advisor for Third Way in their national security program, where I work on their cyber enforcement initiative, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I've been there now for about a year, started in April 2020. So it's about my 1 year anniversary about 2 days ago. Prior to that, though, I spent a number of months with the U.S. Cyberspace Surveillance Commission, which was a congressionally mandated commission that looked at how the U.S. can improve its cyber deterrence. So I spent a number of months there working on recommendations and developing legislative proposals to achieve that end. Prior to the commission, I spent a number of years at the National Governors Association, where I traveled around the country visiting various capitals to work with governors' offices to develop legislation, policies, executive orders related to cybersecurity, technology, and other national security issues, and a lot of which was looking at how we can improve public-private partnership around this issue, which I know is something of keen interest to your listeners. So that's me in a nutshell.
Oh, you're a COVID hire. Did you have that all sorted out before the pandemic showed up?
I sneaked in just in the door before everything happened. The funny thing is I've only been in the office for interviews and have not yet been in the office. So I've been told I have a nice desk and computer and laptop, but so far I've not seen it.
Oh, that's funny.
I hope you do soon.
It's a brave world out there right now. So, Michael, this is great. Today, we're going to unpack the report you authored. And I have to be honest, I've not read the entire thing. I looked it up and it said estimated time to read, like 1 hour, 47 minutes. And I thought to myself, if I had an hour and 47 minutes, maybe I could get through this, but I don't.
And nobody in our audience is going to either. So I was like, let's just short circuit this whole thing and just ask Michael to come in.
And I think that's exactly the purpose of being able to do this. I think this is really important information, and I think this podcast can make it accessible to an even wider audience than you would normally seek to be reaching, I would expect. So. Kip and I have been saying for years that, we're completely outgunned by cyber criminals. It's very, very difficult to stop them as a, individual company. It's the FBI really seems to be much better at arresting, old school physical criminals than digital ones. And what that really does is leave the private sector kind of out in the dark. Without a lot of protection. At least that's how it feels to those of us in the private sector.
Yeah.
And just by way of kind of background, when I was at the Attorney General's office in Washington State, we did partner with federal agencies, and even in the private sector, I've partnered with some of the federal agencies, the Secret Service, the FBI, and it's always a one-way street. There's not a lot of, there's not really a public-private partnership right now, or there's more like a one-way information. I don't want to say exchange. It's an information granting mechanism where we give information to the government and the government stares at us blankly, which is not, which I understand. Having been a government, in government law enforcement, I understand why we do that. However, this just works so well.
It's not helpful for people that are trying to, run businesses on the digital highway.
So, Michael, is there by any chance a, excuse the pun, third way? And if so, who is Third Way and why did they decide to write this report?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jake. You hit on a lot of things, but I think just to kind of hit that last point, Third Way is a center-left think tank organization in DC that covers a whole host of policy areas, a lot of researching and writing on things like healthcare, education, workforce, and then the National Security Program where I reside, where we have our cyber enforcement initiative. And back in 2018, when the initiative began, before my time, but my former colleague, Mika Oyang, she did analysis of a scan of what was being talked about, what was being researched, what was being written about. And she realized that the cybercrime angle was not being mentioned at all. It was a lot of how can we protect our IoT and infrastructure and cyber hygiene, as well as looking at maybe what's going on in Defense Department world and international space, both of which are very important. But you're missing a whole slew of things in the middle in terms of cyber criminals going after not only mom and pop shops as well as individuals, but also attacking Fortune 500 companies. I think you look at Target, Home Depot, Equifax, the list goes on and on, some of which are just lone actors, some of which are abetted by niche state actors. What we saw was that there's not actually a lot of policies being proposed around cybercrime, and especially going after the human actor behind that crime. Because at the end of the day, any cyber incident is actually a crime. So we began developing a series of policies and papers beginning in 2018, really laying out that landscape. And then when I joined in April 2020, we saw a unique need or line of interest in that with the new administration coming in, whether that's going to be the second Trump administration or Biden administration, 116 Congress, we saw that we can really propose some low-level hanging fruit in order to help folks like the FBI, Secret Service, to get at some of the things that you mentioned. So we convened 30 subject matter experts starting in April through June and July of 2020. And these experts range from various former administration jobs in the government, as well as private sector, state and local representatives, and international partners as well, to really tackle this from a holistic framework. I think we're a little too holistic, and that's why the paper is an hour and a half long to read. But we do try to make it a little digestible, because at the very end, we have a pretty nice table in terms of saying who's going to do what, how long it'll take in order to implement the recommendation. And the nice thing about it is that while Third Way ideologically is a center-left institution, our report is nonpartisan in nature, because we really want to show that cybersecurity shouldn't be politicized. It really is nonpartisan, and that anyone, regardless of the administration, could take it on, and whoever controls Congress could take it on as well. And so if you look at the report, it's very much written in that kind of framework, consensus building approach.
Absolutely. That's super helpful.
Gosh.
And you know, it's I have to say I'm actually really impressed with how quickly you guys put this together. I mean, I've been part of kind of team written white papers before, and the fact that you joined about a year ago and yet this thing is already written, I'm actually like, hey, that's amazing. So good job. And great. I think this is you're right. The appendix 1, to our listeners, if you want to, if you don't want to read the entire thing, which, a lot of our listeners just don't have time for, download it, skip to page 62 of the PDF, and you've got the appendix, which is the summary. And that's super helpful by itself to kind of get a sense of what's going on.
Yeah. Michael, one of the reasons why I was so attracted to what you're doing here, this body of work and this report, isn't because I was part of the target audience. I don't think any of us listening right now are really part of your target audience, but it was really about nobody's talking about this problem, as you said, right? I mean, Jake and I are talking about it in terms of, helping our listeners and, and our customers and clients know, like, what's the landscape you're operating in here. But what we don't see is, is serious, credible suggestions for what can be done about it. It seems like a really intractable problem. So I'm just really glad you guys are addressing it. But I was curious. I've never worked with a think tank before. No matter where they fall on the political spectrum. And I'm curious, you gave some background, but I'm still kind of wondering, how does this issue relate to Third Way, and just in terms of its charter, why this? There's lots of intractable problems. Right. It's interested to know why this one.
So I think going to why cybercrime matters, and that we are always trying to identify solutions to challenges that people aren't talking about. And what we found is that cybercrime, at least 1 in 4 American households have been impacted by a form of cybercrime. And honestly, it's probably more than that, because only 1 in 10 people actually report a crime to law enforcement. And if you think of all the personally identifiable information that's been stolen from various types of breaches, especially if folks have worked with the government from OPM, the number is probably closer to 3 and 4, if not all of us, frankly, having some kind of information being stolen. So what you have is the most prevalent form of cybercrime, or crime in America. Yet when we crunch the numbers in terms of arrest rate, we've seen that of the crimes that are reported to FBI, only 3 in 1,000 actually lead to an arrest. So you have the most prevalent form of crime, but the lowest enforcement rate. And so we saw that there is a need in order to kind of bridge that delta and understand that, this impacts every single person, every single business in America, and members of Congress should pay attention to it. Yes, deterring adversaries is important, but actually going some after the criminals is equally important. And that's why I think Third Way started really tackling this issue.
Okay, cool. Now we're going to get to your recommendations, right? Because I want to unpack that. But I just first want to take a little detour and just reemphasize. Jake and I both said, like, we don't think we're in your target audience. Who is in your target audience?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. If you look at the report, it's a lot of FBI should do this, Secret Service should do that. So our target audience was really primarily focused at the federal government, identifying policies and proposals that they should implement. If your audience reads it, it reads very bureaucratic, like a government report almost, which was intentional. So that was our primary audience. For our secondary audience being staffers on congressional committees and other Hill committees to identify legislation that they could implement, because they can easily take out FBI should do XYZ to say Congress should do ABC, with FBI doing these things. That being said, the recommendations do have implications for private sector companies. And I think Jake hit on something really early on, which we could talk about later, like information sharing. And that information sharing regime is not necessarily the issue of private sector, but it's really the federal government getting its own house in order. So we have a slew of recommendations related to that. But even though it's directed at federal government, the outcome is to improve information sharing for the wider private sector ecosystem.
And I would add, it's not just the federal government that needs help here. It's the federal government specifically needs to get its own house in order, and also provide leadership to my new favorite acronym, SLTT. State, local, territorial, and tribal. I just learned that. But the reason that's important is that, as a the way that we have organized our law enforcement in this country harkens back to, like, seriously ye olden days of sheriffs, like the sheriff of Nottingham level olden days. And what that does is it creates these artificial jurisdictions where, when you are a bad guy and you step out of the city of Bellevue into the city of Issaquah, or maybe I should use like cities that people know. So DC into
hey, I know those cities,
but DC into I don't know, Raleigh or something, wherever you're just running around to, you cross these kind of artificial boundaries whereby you kind of escape the ability of the previous law enforcement agency to get you. Now, that used to be like hard stops, like, that we've all seen and heard stories about the 20s and 30s where the state, get across the state line and you're safe.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't work as well anymore. There's a lot of interagency cooperation. But if we're going to tackle cybercrime, which does not care at all about artificial geographical boundaries, we have to take the interagency cooperation and information sharing and interjurisdictional enforcement to an entirely new level. And by the way, how is that for some bureau speak? Just you can tell that I can slip back into that government style pretty quick.
That was impressively confusing to my brain.
Yeah, sorry. But I bet you Michael understood everything I just said.
I hope so.
Oh, complete English to me. Yes.
Yeah. So
Well, so and but it's gosh, I always uh, go back to the 1920s, 1930s in America, gangsters and Bonnie and Clyde, right? The Hollywood movie about, how they would rob banks and escape over state lines and all that stuff. And it took a revolution in law enforcement for that to get addressed, right? So you needed more federal oversight. You needed to actually find new ways of prosecuting people for crimes that were difficult to were easier to prosecute somebody for than the ones that they were actually committing, because they had some really interesting ways of dodging evidence pointing back to them and so forth. I mean, so a lot of gangsters ultimately were convicted of tax evasion as opposed to murder or racketeering or whatever the other things were that they were actually engaged in. So but it was possible because we were still under one single, political jurisdiction, the United States government, federal government. This is different, though, right? Because now we're talking about crossing national boundaries, national borders. This is global. It's transnational, different languages and cultures. I mean, it's not just Alabama versus Mississippi. So it's way harder, right, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's different from traditional crime in that you have victims based in the U.S., but the ones perpetrating the crime are overseas. So as a result, we have to help our 18,000 state and local law enforcement, a lot of which are in rural communities and a lot of which are just five law enforcement officers, some of which really don't have computer investigative backgrounds, trying to then put the pieces together to identify maybe someone who is in the Ukraine. So it is a multinational, multi-jurisdictional issue, which is why I think the report is so long, because we had all these things to deal with.
There's a lot to do.
Yeah, in addition to the interagency issues that Jake pointed out.
There's a lot to do. Oh my gosh, there's so much to do.
well, and I think one of the biggest challenges that I recall from trying to enforce U.S. law is that the bad guys, they simply are in places where it's not a friendly nation state, which makes it even more challenging. And I think that is going to be, that ultimately is a diplomatic problem for, like, literally nobody else but the US State Department can help with that. Nobody else. I mean, it has to be the federal government.
As things are right now, right? So,
Yeah.
but maybe this is a great time to segue into what exactly is being recommended in the report.
Yeah. So as we were talking about, there's a lot of challenges to address. So what we did is, as I mentioned, we had those 30 subject matter experts, convened them, and we broke them out into 3 different working groups, which then created our 3 chapters in a report, which boils down to White House architecture, domestic law enforcement capabilities, and international capability and capacity, which we were just touching upon at the last bit here. So within these 60 recommendations, they fall within those 3 chapters. With the first one, the White House architecture, really looking at how can the federal government become a better coordinator, not only amongst the federal government agencies, but also with its international allies, as well as coordinating with state and local partners, which then could trickle into better cooperation and collaboration with private sector partners. And it makes it so much easier knowing, if I'm a private sector entity, knowing, okay, the FBI is responsible for this, Secret Service does that, State Department does this. Right now, those clear line of efforts do not really exist. They're kind of muddied, and we need to do a better job of fixing that. So that's what Chapter 1 really talks about. Chapter 2 is really looking at how can we provide better coordination amongst domestic law enforcement so that FBI, Secret Service, and DHS are working together and coalescing together, so then it can help with those partners at the state and local level who can then engage with victims, whether they're individuals like us or private sector businesses or other types of entities. And that also encourages we talk about a framework in which we can incentivize reporting mechanisms, information sharing, and better collaboration to share data so that we can go after criminals who live overseas. And that brings me to the 3rd chapter, which is really looking at how can we shape the U.S. government so it could be a better international ally to improve our allies' ability to go after cyber criminals, and also to impose consequences on those countries like China or Russia, who have been known to have connections with criminal syndicates to steal intellectual property information from private businesses. And I think what's fascinating, and one little just like tidbit I want to share with folks, is that we were talking about how the State Department is the only federal government agency that, and really the only entity in the U.S. that could and should be leading these international efforts. Yet for the State Department, we don't have a cyber technology bureau. It
Yeah.
doesn't exist. And that was one of our key recommendations. It's one of the main recommendations is that we are dealing in the 21st century, yet our main department engaging in international affairs is not equipped to handle this 21st century challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Totally agree.
Wow.
Totally agree. I mean,
Wow.
this is
There's
a
so
huge, major problem. I think it would be worthwhile to maybe hit on a couple of points within the kind of specifics. Like, I'm curious if you had to pick, um, one or two of the most important kind of recommendations in there. Like, if you had to pick two or three things that, like, I can wave this magic wand and they're going to do this, what would you choose? What do you think is the most important? Because, according to the this table here, there's 16 kind of main points, and then, as you said, 60 plus overall. You can go ahead and pick from the 16 main points. We'll make it a little easier. But I'm kind of curious, what do you think it would have the most immediate effect on helping to begin, to really begin to deal with this problem?
Closing this gap. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really difficult because to me, they're all equally important, as any author should say about his recommendations.
You love all
but
your children equally.
Exactly. But some of them I like a bit more. I think the way I'll do this is I'll talk about the ones that I think will have the greatest impact for private sector partners, which I think is really important and probably most germane to this conversation. And they kind of equally are within the three chapters I mentioned. First and foremost is information sharing. And it killed me to even put it into the paper because since the dawn of the internet, we've been talking about information sharing. I mean, I think people slap their hands against their face when they hear it because it's just something we've been trying to do forever now. And as I mentioned, it's not necessarily information flowing from private sector up. It's the opposite in that the federal government does not provide actionable, timely, and relevant information to private partners, nor do they really know the needs of their private partners, which, that's not slamming the federal government. There are tons of private individuals who have various needs and equities at stake with their companies, and there's various sectors, but they all need to have tailored information. So one of our key objectives is to have a more streamlined, thoughtful approach in which you're not going to get information from FBI, Secret Service, and the whole host of agencies that have information. But there should be a streamline in which it's one vector to share information down. And also, when private sector shares any information to any federal point, that information is then shared writ large across the whole federal enterprise. And because right now, I know Jake probably understands this more than anyone here, but there's so much bureaucratic infighting that when the federal government receives a piece of information, it's mine. That is mine. I'm not going to share it. I need to protect this because that's my interest. We need to break down those silos, and that then will help with information sharing.
Absolutely, and I think there are some good models out there. I think the FBI's InfraGard is a good example. I think it can, that but bigger would be a really good start.
Absolutely. And I think there's so many of these ISACs and ISOs that I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with. Leveraging those is really important. So I think that's number one. Number two is that we need to do a better job of institutionalizing relationships between federal government, state and local, and private partners. And it's really a three-legged bar stool. You need all three legs in order for the stool to be held into place. Right now, too often, it's based off of personal relationships. Right now, maybe me and Jake have a really good relationship, so I'll hit him up and say, "Hey, Jake, I've been seeing these weird TTPs on my network," or I'm seeing some activity. But if Jake leaves and all of a sudden it's just Kip taking Jake's place, maybe I don't like Kip, so I'm not going to work that agency anymore. And we can't have that. So we have a series of recommendations in terms of what is each federal agency's responsibility for certain issue areas? When should they be called? And how can we make sure that private partners understand that and that it's an institutionalized relationship rather than a personal relationship? And I think to drive down a little further is something that we call operational collaboration, which is a term that's been floated throughout government now for the past few years. But it's the notion of we talk about public-private partnership a lot, but we need to operationalize it and make it into action. And so we recommend for a framework in which you could bring in private sector partners and public entities to work together in order to identify maybe malicious command and control systems and take them down. And there's a couple of examples that I could point to, but that's another area in which we see that you can have better collaboration with private sector partners.
And I would say, I mean, Kip, you and I have one of the best examples of this right in our backyard. The Microsoft Digital Crimes Unit has been incredibly active in working with state, local, federal, and international government entities to bring down botnets. It's amazing to me that a private corporation that is, that literally by law has to be focused on shareholder value and profit is able and willing to.
It's performing a law enforcement.
It's performing a law enforcement function, and it's doing it better than law enforcement, and that should be something that is really looked at by the federal government.
Well, and I think Michael, I kind of hear you touching on this subject a little bit, but I think where we also need to go in this conversation is an acknowledgement that private sector probably has more of the tools and more of the understanding of the problem space
and the expertise,
which is why we're seeing that. But it also comes with a downside, which is private sector doesn't trust government enough to fully let them, enter into an equal partnership, and so that's absolutely a cultural barrier, which is not dissimilar to the FBI counterintelligence versus CIA counterintelligence, where we've got political boundaries, declaring where these organizations can operate. And then that brings us to the Snowden revelations, and so man, it just seems like a big sweaty hairball here, and it's going to be really hard to. I mean, without some kind of a crisis, right? I just don't know that we're going to be able to really, tackle this and achieve some of the revolutions, not evolutions, but revolutions in thinking and behaving that are probably going to be necessary. So, this all leaves me kind of a bit despondent.
I don't blame you.
And again, if I'm thinking about our audience, right, I'm like, oh my goodness, if anyone's still listening at this point, they must be thinking like, what do I do? Like, it's like the cavalry is not coming, right? Like none of this stuff's going to get resolved anytime soon, unless you know something, Michael, that we don't. And so I just can't help but to then move on to this like, what should our listeners be thinking about your report? What should they be asking their elected representatives to do? And like, what should they do? I mean, is there any relief coming for them?
Add one more question to that list, what could they be doing now to promote these goals? Obviously report to the FBI, use IC3, all that stuff. But I think that's equally important is what can they do now to make this happen?
Right. So I think I'll actually key off that last point in that I understand the trepidation of not reporting to federal government for a whole host of concerns, and primarily of which is regulatory blowback or any kind of financial injuries that they could face. But I do think that first and foremost, that if a company gets hit with ransomware, malware, or any kind of incident, that reporting to law enforcement is really important because the federal government actually has a lot of good resources to bear. I know this conversation has been talking about how they need to be improved, but they actually have done a lot in the past years, and various agencies have a lot they can offer. And there are stopgap measures in that if you report something to the FBI, that's not necessarily going to be reported then to the SEC or any other kind of regulatory framework. But I understand some of the issues related to that. And that's why I think tapping into some of these ISALs and ISACs that we were discussing earlier, in that if you're not part of your local ISAL, that maybe you're a retail shop, there's a retail ISAL that's out there that shares a lot of good information, and it's a good way to put a middleman between yourself and the federal government, yet you can still intake federal government data while not necessarily touching them. And lastly, and it's something that we haven't touched upon yet, and I think would be good to touch upon, is the workforce issue. And, it's not only federal government, the private sector sees it too. There's a huge workforce gap. There's actually a website that the National Institute for Standards and Technology put out that really looks at the workforce gap. And I think part of that gap, though, is that far too often we see cybersecurity as an IT issue, when it's really so much more as an IT challenge. And so
it's a business challenge, I think.
It is. But as a result, though, you need to make sure that when you put out your open applications out there, that you frame it in which you're not going to deter people who don't have a computer science or cybersecurity background. And then that also helps you to diversify your employment base, because right now, far too often, women and people of color are not making up the largest cybersecurity workforce, and you're losing out on kind of that diversification of issues. So I think those are the three things I'd point out.
Dang, but there's no silver bullet.
There is no silver bullet.
I was hoping you'd have one.
We could turn the internet off and call it a day.
That would.
Well, for those of us of a certain
problem.
age, we know how to survive, right, in an environment like that. I'm reminded of,
and myself included, literally does not know how to survive if you turn the internet off.
I'm reminded of conversations with customers, and I talk about, like their business continuity plan, their disaster recovery plan, and I often ask them, I'm like, so what are you going to do if you can't actually access your file server to read the plan that you should be following when something bad happens, right? And it's like, we should probably print these things. And I'm like, I know the poor millennials they're not really going to know what to do with a pencil in their hands, and we're just going to have to train them.
Yep.
Yeah, but we may end up back in that type of a world anyway, right? If we can't govern this internet thing, then tragedy of the commons, pick your metaphor, but it's like, I just get concerned that eventually it's going to be so dangerous to do business on the internet that people are just going to really struggle with this. And really, if it costs more to do business on the internet than you're making in profit, then what do we do? Right. So it's kind of a dystopian little vision of the world. Sorry. But anyways. Okay. Well, listen, we're just about out of time for the episode here today. We're really glad you joined us. Thank you for being our guest. Why don't you tell everyone how to find yourself on the internet, and Third Way, and anything else you want to mention?
Yeah, so just go to thirdway.org, brings you up to the Third Way website, and you can go to the National Security Program, and then there, click on Cyber, and you'll see all of our reports, our op-eds, our events. You'll see my contact information. It's mgarcia@thirdway.org if you want to reach out to me via email. And I am always trying to engage with folks in the private sector. I know you look at our papers, they tend to be congressional or government-facing. But hearing input from private partners is really important for us, so that we can help better inform policymakers on the Hill and the federal government.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up another episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. And today we talked about a report that our guest Michael Garcia co-authored. It's called A Roadmap to Strengthen U.S. Cyber Enforcement. Where do we go from here? And we learned all about where the federal government should be going. But for us, people trying to operate in the private sector on the internet, I wish there was more for us, but I think we're just going to have to continue to grapple with the problems we already have in our hands. But thank you, Michael, for trying to move the needle on this, and thanks everybody for being here. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Remember that cyber risk management is a team sport, so include your senior decision makers, legal department, HR, and IT for full effectiveness. So, if you want to manage cyber as the dynamic business risk it has become, we can help. Find out more by visiting us at cyberriskopportunities.com and focallaw.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.